Module 8 talks about specifically working with families in a group dynamic. One of the most important factors is to remember that this idea of family group sessions can account for many different types of families, whether it's a teenager with their siblings and parents, whether it's a married couple, or even, I know I recently had an example in my personal life of one of my friends who's an adult with her adult siblings seeking family help with her older parents and the siblings' significant others. So as we all know, families can look very different, and so it's important to be mindful of some of those different composition aspects we might see. When we talk about families in general, we know that all families not only differ on their composition, but also in their culture. And so when working with a married couple, they might have different goals than a family with an adolescent with acting out behaviors. When we think of my friend and her family, we're thinking of a family with little experience in a mental health field, as well as older adults that are apprehensive about talking with conflict and talking to mental health professionals in general. This is also a family in this example where the adult children have little religious affiliation, where the parents have strong religious affiliations. So when we think of this family group dynamic, it can certainly be helpful for a practitioner to be aware of this, to understand all the needs that the different members in this example family might have. Additionally, if we're working with a family with significantly different cultures than us, we need to be mindful of this in order to be culturally sensitive. And we talk a lot about being culturally competent and culturally sensitive throughout every aspect of this course and all of the classes, but it's important to focus on specifically in family group dynamics because it can seem a little bit different than working with an individual on a one-on-one setting. Some different cultures might be something that we're not familiar with, and so it's important that we're able to ask families and engage with them and have our own knowledge. I think of a few examples, one involving a former colleague of mine from Somalia. He would often tell me about his children who were ages 15 to 19, and he focused on the importance of his 19-year-old son getting married soon, but then he would encourage me to stay unmarried for as long as possible. And so one day I asked him about that, why do you have such different opinions? And he explained to me that culturally for his family, it was really important to them for his children to marry young, but in a different culture, in my culture, he would advocate something different. And so if we were working with his family in a group setting, that would be something that's really important to know. The module talks about a culturegram, which is a really interesting tool that adds some different ideas into asking questions about a family's culture, and different than our genogram or eco maps that we've done previously because it focuses in on this important factor of culture. Some of the interesting components that I found very helpful and was a good reminder for me listening to the podcast again was the reasons for the family relocating and legal status as well. And it got me thinking about a time where I missed asking these questions when working with a family, and how if the family didn't share this information with me on their own volition, I would have missed the bigger picture. So I wanted to share this example because I thought it was helpful for this week's material. So I once worked with a family that was in a car accident with their children. I met with them as part of my job to assess for trauma symptoms, process the event, as well as address some family conflict that was seen to other staff in a hospital setting. In speaking with the mom, she largely denied all the typical risk factors I assess for, things like domestic violence, children's services involvement, mental health concerns, so on. She did tell me that they recently moved from South America, and I didn't ask much about that in order to avoid her feeling compelled to tell me her legal status, which I didn't care about. And as in the podcast, if you've listened to it, it's sometimes not asking can backfire. And then being able to ask in a way that you're being sensitive is important as well. But she ended up becoming very emotional and had a very strong emotional response to a question I asked about who she used for support. And ultimately, she shared with me that her family moved to Ohio due to significant sexual assault she experienced from her brothers for years. And as well as that in her home village in South America, there were concerns for organ trafficking, and that while she was living in this village, several kids had gone missing, and so she was fearful for her own young children. And thinking about that, I never would have thought to ask those questions. And maybe not, I wouldn't have asked specifically about organ trafficking, but in asking her what her decision to relocate was, by me avoiding that question, or not avoiding, but by me not thinking of that question, I really missed a large dynamic to this family setting that they had. There was a lot of stress, more stress even than just from relocating to a new place where you don't speak the language, but also the significant trauma they had experienced. And what that was being shown through, or how that was manifested in the way their family presented. It really changed the purpose of my session with this family, because from there we were able to talk more about seeking asylum. We were able to talk more about some trauma resources that were available and connect them with a legal aid referral. So while this turned out to be successful, missing some of those vital questions about culture and some of the major stressors and trauma that this family had experienced, it would have gone unnoticed. So I encourage you to please listen to the podcast with Dr. Elaine Congress about culturegrams. And even though it's pretty lengthy, her work is really interesting and can definitely inspire us to seek other changes. And it'll be interesting to see, since that podcast was done in 2008, from then, what could we also add to this culturegram, or what can we add in our own culturegrams moving forward? And even if we're not specifically filling out this diagram with a group, at least asking some of those questions while we're doing this family assessment in a group setting. I've also posted a link for a video on YouTube. It looks like it was probably made for a class assignment from another university, but this student is explaining how to use or what a culturegram is to a fictitious client. It seems like she's doing so for a project, but I thought she did a good job of being able to explain this on a one-to-one level. So I wanted to post that just so some people could get an idea. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.